This is a very, very special topic. And this is very much a talk for Bridget and also for Terry Truitt, because of course here we are in this spectacular garden. So before I begin, I want to talk a little bit about this painting which was on the poster that you received. And it's called The Soul of the Rose, and it was painted in 1908 by John William Waterhouse, a somewhat interesting English artist. And when I look at this, I find it a rather sentimental painting, but there's a restrained sexuality about it, because look at this young woman. Her cheeks are flushed. She's got one hand pressed against the garden wall as she inhales the scent of the rose, and the rose a sign of purity. And there's usually an underlying link in between women, nature, and regeneration in the paintings of John William Waterhouse. Now, in gardens, nature is corralled to satisfy human needs. In the words of garden critic Tim Richardson, the garden is a work of art which is a process, not a product, and that process includes death and decay. But the memory of a garden can be preserved in a poet's verse, or a writer's impassioned description, or an artist's painting or drawing. And throughout centuries, it's thanks to artists that we have a seemingly endless and abundant supply of gardens and botanical images. And this morning, you'll see depictions of horticultural earthly delights. But first, a little history about gardens in art, followed by how a variety of artists have immortalized their passion for the glorious world of gardens. Then a look at a few horticultural obsessions, and finally, applause for all of those who make it happen, the gardeners and garden designers. So as you know, I like to begin my talks with a few pertinent quotes. So Claude Monet, "My garden is my most beautiful masterpiece." Alexander Pope, the 18th century essayist and satirist, who said, "All gardening is landscape painting." And Mexico's own Luis Barragan, "The perfect garden, no matter its size, should enclose nothing less than the entire universe." So archaeological evidence of gardening predates surviving garden imagery by more than 7,000 years. So garden historians rely on art to reconstruct plans and plantings of ancient gardens. Many fresco fragments recovered from tombs, such as this one, demonstrate that the Egyptian garden was designed for recreation and food production. Gardens were laid out according to a simple plan: rows of trees planted in regular patterns, rectangular pools of water, and high walls to protect against desert sands, intruders, and the Nile floodwaters. The garden's perimeter walls separated an inner, defined, and orderly world from an outer, chaotic, and unpredictable one. The Roman garden could serve as a hortus, that is a vegetable garden, as a recreational space, or as a place of study and concentration. And over time, gardens became a prestigious ornament of sumptuous private residences. And fresco decorations, and here we have an example, and I think Wendy has actually seen this in the flesh, so to speak. Fresco decorations began to appear on the interior walls of homes, depicting lush gardens with trees and flowering plants against a blue sky. And then we have one mythical garden, the Garden of Hesperides. And the Hesperides were guardians of the tree that produced the golden apples given by the earth, Gaia, to Hera, the goddess, when she married Zeus. And the Hesperides lived in a remote but idyllic garden and were assisted by a dragon or a snake. And the English artist, Edward Burne-Jones, always had a keen interest in classical and mythological themes. On the right, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, Familiar to many of us as one of the 7 wonders of the world, myths surround Nebuchadnezzar's motivation for building them. Were they a declaration of power, a peace offering, or a gift to his wife? And although archaeological investigations at the site of one of his palaces have uncovered brick arches and a mechanism for carrying water, many scholars remain skeptical about the feasibility of raising water to the reputed height of the gardens. And Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Garden and paradise are frequently used interchangeably because the concept of paradise is often described as a beautiful, perfect garden, particularly referencing the Garden of Eden in the Bible, where paradise, derived from the Persian word, and I apologize, Mansour, for my pronunciation, the paradisa, meaning enclosed park or garden. The notion of paradise as a garden predates Islam, Judaism, Christianity, and even the Garden of Eden. It stems from the Sumerian period 4000 BCE in Mesopotamia. Now, as described in the Old Testament, Lucas Cranach the Elder depicts paradise as a beautiful Garden of Eden filled with animals who live peacefully with one another. And here we have the biblical stories of Adam and Eve being told in simultaneous actions. So if you look at them under the tree, there's the apple. In the middle, you can see the creation of Adam and Eve. And then here we have them being admonished and they're about to be expelled. And I love the way that Eve has rather coyly got her hand over Adam's genital area. So what I found fascinating about this is that Lucas Cranach the Elder and his workshop painted over 50 different versions of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And I love this quote, which is apparently George Bernard Shaw's. "If Eve had had a spade in paradise and known what to do with it, we should not have had all that sad business of the apple." And on the right, we have Babur supervising the Garden of Fidelity. Babur was the first Mughal emperor. He was a poet and a patron of the arts. He was fascinated by the natural world, and it was a passion he expressed in innovative garden designs for the capitals he established throughout his reign. And the Garden of Fidelity that you see here, built near Kabul in 1508, was his favorite. And Babur is the gentleman in the rather wonderful yellow coat. As a place of pleasure and happiness, the Islamic garden is indivisibly linked with paradise. It's regular in form, divided into 4 parts, corresponding to the parts of the world. The 4 canals allude to the rivers of paradise in which flow milk, honey, wine, and honey. Sorry, milk, honey, water, and wine. In the arid climate of the eastern desert, the garden becomes a sign of civilization. On the left, Garden of Paradise. Now, this small, exquisite painting was created to give a pious patron a glimpse of paradise. The setting is a contemporary pleasure garden, and the regal woman in blue, whom you see in the center with a book, is the Virgin Mary. And her central position indicates that this is a hortus conclusus, that is, an enclosed garden, which serves as a metaphor for her purity. On the left, in the red gown, you can see St. Dorothy picking cherries, and that's the fruit of paradise. Now, with every flower in bloom, this tranquil garden transcends the cycle of seasons. Mary's flowers, roses, lilies, and violets, celebrate her exemplary womanhood. And the purple flag irises that you can see at the back forecast her son's sacrifice. On the right, we have the Garden of Love, or the Fountain of Life. And this fictional depiction of a medieval garden by the Italian friar and humanist Leonardo Dati is symbolic of courtly love. And this was a theme often appearing in secular artwork from the beginning of the 15th century in Europe. These images were a world away from the religious depictions of the Garden of Eden. Instead, they celebrated indulgence and romance, as symbolized here by the blossoming trees, flowery meadow, and the various nude individuals you see frolicking in the fountain. Holding a shovel in one hand is Saint Fiacre, and he's presented as the patron saint of gardeners. A 7th century saint, he earned the right to establish a hermitage and a hospice for the poor after he single-handedly cleared an entire forest in one day. Famed for growing many kinds of vegetables and herbs in his garden in France, he made and dispensed many herbal remedies. And he had a reputation for healing hemorrhoids, which were called Saint Fiacre's figs in the Middle Ages. His reputed aversion to women, and apparently he didn't like women because a woman had seen him clearing the forest single-handedly, and she believed that he must be the devil or he must be Satan. So that's why apparently he hated women. But Saint Fiacre is also considered the patron saint of victims of venereal disease, in addition to being the patron saint of taxi drivers, florists, and box makers. On the right, Xochipilli, the god of beauty, love, fertility, arts, and flowers. And he's one of 3 Aztec flower gods, the prince of flowers and noble flowery. Doris Hayden, a renowned expert on the mythology and symbolism of flora in pre-Hispanic Mexico, wrote at length about the importance of flowers as they accompanied humans from conception and birth to death and burial. And it's been said that Aztec poetry is one big hymn to flowers. But it's a very sad fact that today not a single Aztec garden plan remains. And we're left, ironically, with in some cases, quite detailed descriptions written by the Spanish conquerors before they ravaged what must have been truly beautiful garden landscapes. For example, Cortés, in his second letter to Charles V of Spain in 1520, wrote in glowing terms about the palace garden of Moctezuma's brother at Ixtapalapa. And I quote, "There are very refreshing gardens with many trees and sweet-scented flowers, bathing places of fresh water. There was also a large orchid near the house." On the left, the Badianos manuscript of 1552. Now, this was the first illustrative and descriptive scientific text of Nahua medicine and botany produced in the Americas. It contains 185 illustrations of herbs used for treatment, and the botanical aspects of the manuscript show that the Nahua had a highly sophisticated classification system. Subject headings for plants' curative powers include against stupidity of the mind, against goaty armpits of the sick people, against lassitude, and medicine to take away foul and fetid breath. The manuscript, composed by Martin de la Cruz in Nahuatl, was then translated into Latin by Juan Badiano. In 1990, 4 centuries after it left Mexico, Pope John Paul II returned the manuscript to Mexico, and it's now in the National Institute of Anthropology and History in Mexico City. On the right, we have La Flora del Valle de Mexico. Most well known are Jose Maria Velasco's landscape paintings, but in the late 1860s, he was hired to sketch a variety of Mexican plant species and ended up producing 18 individual lithographic prints, of which this is one. Now, while the complete book was never published, examples of the original printed and unbound pages survive at the Library of the Institute of Biology in Mexico City. The Spaniards systematically destroyed the Chinampas, those series of artificial islands and peninsulas with a maze of canals and raised gardens, and they destroyed them all except for Xochimilco, which is now considered the most fertile agricultural system in history because of its 1,000-year reservoir of nutrients and minerals. And this wonderful watercolor gouache by Miguel Covarrubias presents a charming rendition of a typical Sunday afternoon in Mexico City's Xochimilco. But I say the enduring importance of the Chinampas cannot be overemphasized. And La Ofrenda on the left by Saturnino Herrán, one of my favorite artists. This work, painted during the Revolution, shows the cultural syncretism between the Spanish and indigenous worlds, and it alludes to preparation for Dia de Muertos in Xochimilco. And on the right, by Pedro Diego Alvarado, his work focuses on still lifes that depict the limitless abundance of the Mexican natural world. Mexico is home to more than 25,000 different species of the world's fauna. And Jennifer Clement, the Mexican-American author who's known the artist since childhood, wrote this about his work. Pedro Diego has a unique feel for the mysterious patterns of nature. His colors seem to suddenly vibrate, which adds a sense of ecstasy to his paintings. Now, the British feminist artist Linda Sterling believes that flowers are basically nature's pornography. On the left, we have Azoteas de la Ciudad de Mexico, which depicts a woman on her Mexico City roof garden attended by her maids. A water cellar approaches from the left, and what I love is the little grouping of the bushes on the left, but what interests me in particular is the carpet, because the carpet to me looks rather like a formal parterre, a series of formal gardens. And on the right, the roof garden, and this is a roof garden at Chapultepec Castle. So at the invitation of Emperor Maximilian, botanist Wilhelm Knechtel created this roof garden above the service rooms of the castle. The garden became the imperial court's favorite place to promenade and later found favor when Porfirio Diaz was president. And a complete contrast, the village of Seckerton, 1585 to 93, by John White, Theodore de Bry after John White. So John White, in addition to being a member of the 1585 Expeditionary Force, which came from England with the idea of colonizing the North American coastline, he was also an artist and made watercolor sketches of a settlement belonging to a First Nations population called the Seckerton. A few years later in Europe, the engraver Theodore de Bry reproduced White's sketches for publication, but he improved them with heightened color and new details. So if you look on the left, you can see a circular flower bed, and just above it, there are some sunflowers. So what he did, he wanted to make the settlement more attractive to his audience. So he's made Seckerton look rather like a European rural village. And on the right, Mount Vernon. In 1761, George Washington inherited a large estate near the Potomac River in the state of Virginia. Now, he was a passionate gardener, and when he was in residence, he oversaw every aspect of the garden's upkeep. And in 1783, after resigning his commission as Commander-in-Chief of the Colonial Army, he devoted all his time to his Mount Vernon estate. So let's move on to artists and their passions for gardens. So on the left, we have the very famous Déjeuner sur l'herbe, luncheon on the grass. Now, this was rejected by the 1863 Paris Salon. And it was exhibited by Manet under the title Le Bain, the Bath, at the Salon des Refusés, which was the alternative exhibition space for those artists whose work had been turned down by the very conservative Paris Salon. So at the Salon des Refusés, it was the main attraction, and it was a source of mockery and a source of scandal. One critic described it as a young man's practical joke. There was, for example, the absurdity of one naked woman, plus the other one in the background who was scantily dressed. And here they are in the company of two fully dressed men, perhaps in a garden or perhaps a wooded grove. And the complete contrast on the right, Holy Day, also known as The Picnic, by the French artist James Tissot. And it was painted in 1876. And the composition is set in the artist's wealthy North London suburb garden, where he lived after moving to England in 1871. The painting shows us a group of elegantly dressed men and women during a picnic near the pond in the painter's garden. But Manet's influence is very evident in Tissot's choice of subject, and it's reminiscent of his Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe. Holy Day is not a provocative painting in the same way as Déjeuner sur l'herbe is. Rather, to me, it's suffused with a stiff British conservatism. In the late 18th century, the Tuileries Gardens in Paris became one of the first royal parks in Europe to admit members of the public to certain areas. And by the time Manet painted his view of a Sunday afternoon concert, most of the gardens were open to the public. The Tuileries attracted crowds of upwardly mobile Parisians who enjoyed the freedom to stroll, picnic, or listen to music in once restricted grounds. And another park scene, A Day in June by George Bellows. Having moved from Ohio to New York in 1904, George Bellows enjoyed taking daily walks around the city, and whenever he could, he spent time in Central Park. And returning to the studio, he transferred whatever he had seen onto paper or canvas because he preferred working indoors rather than the French practice of painting en plein air. Working from memory, Bellows translated the sensations of heat and light into color. So here we have the glare of the sun, blindingly bright on the white fabric of the women's dresses. It conveys the feeling of the first really hot day of summer. And by contrast, the deep green of the lawn and the shaded trees provides a sense of pleasurable relief. In the background, the crown of a high-rise building can be seen, which identifies the locale as Central Park, an oasis of shade and space in the crowded city throughout the long, hot, humid summer. Two very different English gardens, and I would like you to remember these two as I show you two more later on. Gertrude Jekyll, who was born in 1843 and died in 1932, was a British horticulturalist, a garden designer, a writer, and an artist. And she created or gave advice on more than 400 gardens in Britain, North America, and Europe. And her influence on garden design continues to this day. She authored or co-authored 11 books about gardens and garden design. And in her flower borders, this is one of her herbaceous borders, she arranged her colors in progressive tonal harmonies, cool to vivid to cool, so that each portion became a picture in itself. Now, this was painted by Helen Allingham, who was a well-known English garden painter. And she was one of the women artists who made a considerable impact, which was very unusual because female artists still, at that time, certainly were not gaining the same recognition. So it's known that Helen Allingham had a considerable impact on, for example, Vincent van Gogh. And on the right, a totally different excuse me, because this is in Sussex, is in a more rural setting. And on the right, this series of brick terraced houses lined the Pound, and the Pound was a narrow street leading to the railway station in the artist Stanley Spencer's hometown of Cookham in the south of England. So even though everybody had a very small front garden, each garden had a distinctive character. And what I really love are those splashes of the red salvia. And Stanley Spencer marveled at the beauty to be found in the humble environments in his hometown of Cookham. Now, I forgot to say that Antonio Haas, who wrote Gardens in Mexico, talked about the fact that Mexican gardens are they're always behind walls. They're never seen from the street, and that is something which is very different from here. But what he says is one reason that these gardens in Mexico are behind walls is because otherwise it would be too dangerous. And the courtyard of the hospital at Arles. In the early months of 1889, Vincent van Gogh suffered from intermittent delusions, and complaints about his erratic behavior prompted the local authorities to recommend that he be confined to a hospital. He painted several canvases during his confinement, including this one of the hospital courtyard. And the view depicts the garden as a respite from the tedium of life on the wards. And although he was never an active gardener himself, he believed that a troubled soul could find tranquility and consolation in a garden setting. And in 1890, just a few weeks before his death, he wrote to his mother, "For one's health, it's very necessary to work in the garden and see the flowers growing." On the right, this photograph of Frida Kahlo is one of several of her, taken in the garden at Casa Azul by the German-born French photographer and photojournalist Gisèle Freund. In the late 1940s, Diego Rivera expanded Casa Azul and added a courtyard garden to include a stepped pyramid, a fountain, and a reflecting pool. The garden was a vibrant place filled with plants, flowers, and artifacts that inspired Kahlo's art. And I love this photograph of her because she looks so regal, so imperial. And of course, no talk about gardens would be complete without Manet. So Claude Monet, not Manet, Claude Monet famously said, "Aside from painting and gardening, I'm good for nothing." At the turn of the 20th century, devotees of modern art shared a single desire, and that was to be invited into Claude Monet's garden in Giverny. His monumental canvases of his water garden, painted in the last decade of his life, and some of them painted during the First World War, which was happening not that far from Giverny. And they are the ultimate expression of the symbiosis between his garden and his art. And Jamaica Kincaid, the Antiguan American novelist and essayist and a keen gardener herself, had the following to say about Monet's garden at Giverny. "What would the garden be without the paintings? Would the garden at Giverny mean so much to me and all the other people traipsing around without the paintings?" So it's a very good point to remember. On the right, Prospect Cottage and Garden, Dungeness. In December 1986, 44-year-old English filmmaker Derek Jarman received a positive HIV diagnosis. When he got the news, he decided to move out of London, and he bought a small coastal cottage with a sparse, bleak beach garden. No trees, no fields, only the sea to the south and marshland to the north. Jarman reshaped the gravel beach surrounding his home and turned it into a sculpture garden. And although there was little to work with, he managed to cultivate plants which could endure the unforgiving coastal environment. He collected driftwood and discarded rusting metal engine parts to create sculptures. He wrote that forming the garden had acted as a therapy and a pharmacopoeia for him. And 8 years after moving there, he died of AIDS-related complications, and the project came to an end. So although he didn't create this garden for an audience, today it attracts thousands and thousands of visitors every year and has become a place of such significance that in 32 years after his death, enough money was raised in 2020 to acquire Prospect Cottage and its garden for the nation. Patio Garden José de Iturbe. The French garden designer Anita Pereire has described his work in this way. His colourful outdoor-indoor rooms are invigorating designs which imply communication and entertainment. And this terrace with its strongly outlined maguey plants is a tribute to the sun, the sky, and Mexican vegetation. And the journalist Laura Durango noted, he adores colour, the absence of artifice, the richness of space, and visual serenity. And on the right, very, very different garden, Frente de la Casa by Elena Clement, who is absolutely one of my favorite artists and who lives in Cuernavaca. Her spare, evocative still lifes have long expressed her reverence for ordinary, everyday things and everyday Mexican life and Mexicans' penchant for embellishing the humblest of dwellings with special decorative touches of all kinds, as we can see here. And here is the Antonio Haas quote, the proper one. The Mexican garden has never shown itself on the street. Too dangerous. Hotel Romano de Angeles Acatlan. For nearly 60 years, David Hockney has never not been a focus of attention. And it was chance that brought the painter to the now famous hotel. In 1984, he was on his way to the Museo Rufino Tamayo to present his exhibition, Hockney Paints the Stage. But his car broke down and he was forced to stay at the hotel while it was fixed. However, for him, a tedious experience turned into a great opportunity because he was enchanted by the hotel's inner courtyard, which featured a well with a red brick arch and lush green vegetation. It was a vibrant, tropical, colourful scene, and that was exactly what the painter has captured. Here is David Hockney en plein air, and on the right is one of David Hockney's iPad drawings. In 2018, aged 81, he bought a house with 4 acres of land in Normandy, and in 2019, during the early months of the pandemic, lockdown, during a Zoom call with his close friend, the art critic and writer Martin Gayford, David Hockney spoke about what a garden meant to him. And I quote, "In the Bible and other ancient texts, every important place is a garden. Even in LA, I am always drawing my garden. What's wonderful when you go to Giverny is to think about the paintings of it, not photographs." So his iPad drawings were first presented in 2010 at the Musée Yves Saint Laurent in Paris, where they were displayed on iPhones and iPads. And one of the things he said was that what a wonderful medium the iPad was, but he was at a loss how to make iPad drawings pay. Now, I asked you to remember, actually, the David Hockney you've just seen, but also the Helen Allingham and the Stanley Spencer, because I look at these two gardens, both of which are in England, and this tells me exactly why I'm standing before you today in a beautiful garden in Mexico. Because I'm really fascinated by these two pieces. The one on the left is part of a larger painting by an artist called David Royson. And it's the view from his childhood home. And it's his recollection of the garden in late autumn or fall. And he has very fond memories of playing in this garden as a child. But I look at this, and what I see is a very bleak, a very sterile, a very unwelcoming environment. And on the right, I came across this photograph in the Guardian newspaper a couple of months ago. There was no caption. All it said was football widow. And I have no idea what football team it is, but for the fact that this poor woman, perhaps she's a football supporter as well. I don't know what team it is, but she's mowing the lawn with the team colours. If she's going to sit down, she sits on a bench that's team colours. So these, I think you've seen very different extremes of gardens in England. Very different. And the translation, like a garden in a haystack. This is by Betsy B. Romero, the Mexican visual artist. And her work is grounded in the history and traditions of Mexico. And she intentionally uses materials which have been used and then discarded. So this school bus, she converted into a garden that she installed in Chimalhuacan on the outskirts of Mexico City. And children were invited to get on, and it became the only green space in the area. Now, on the right, we have the South London Gallery Garden, which is in the south of London. And Gabriel Orozco, the great Mexican artist Gabriel Orozco, he was invited in 2016 to design the garden in this gallery. He had already had an exhibition there. And it consists of York stone and yellow bricks, which are local to the area. He selected plants for their sculptural shapes and forms, and his design references board games and how people use the space. And it's his intention that the garden should eventually become like an overgrown urban ruin. The labyrinth. The labyrinth is a symbol of disorientation and searching. And one of its peculiarities is that one doesn't know how far away the exit is or how to find one's way back to the entrance. And the artist P.J. Crook gives us a surreal perspective of the labyrinth, with its infinite series of labyrinthine rooms in which identical women are busy at different tasks. And on the right, this maze was created as an homage to Jorge Luis Borges, and it was created by the diplomat, maze designer, and friend of Borges, Randall Coate, and it's in San Rafael, Mendoza, Argentina. It's spread out over 8,700 square meters of land, and it consists of over 12,000 box hedges. It's shaped like an open book, with the spine running down the center. Within the confines of the pages, the twisting hedges spell out Borges both forward and backward in a mirror image. But Borges wasn't alive to see this monument to his life and work. But given his interest in mazes, layers, and labyrinths, one assumes he would have loved it. On the left, Toronto Music Garden. Now, the Toronto Music Garden was created in collaboration with the eminent cellist Yo-Yo Ma and designer Julia Mesavy. Apparently, the concept was first presented to the city of Boston, but Boston wasn't interested, so Toronto was very keen to have it. And it's a 3-acre public park on Toronto's waterfront. And the park's design was inspired by the first suite for unaccompanied cello by Johann Sebastian Bach. Curving paths move visitors through 6 garden movements that flow from the different moods, feelings, and forms evoked by the music. And on the right, I'm very happy to be talking about de Lau and La Espiral de Cítricos. If you aren't familiar with de Lau, it is the most wonderful sculpture garden, which is outside Tepoztlan, and its founder, its inventor, its genius is Eduardo Olbes, who is here, Eduardo the sculptor. And I'm glad that he's here because I was going to tell you that the citrus spiral, I was going to tell you that there were over 100 different varieties of citrus trees, but fortunately I checked with Eduardo and he told me that there are only 20 different varieties. So I had given you 80 more. But in total on this land, he has planted over 900 trees. And if you haven't had the chance to go and see it, do, and also sample the amazing lemon ice cream. And what is a garden without a little cold weather, but also without some topiaries? And the topiary, the use of topiary, which is shaping bushes into particular shapes, whether it's animals or geometric shapes, it became widespread over the course of the Renaissance, the 15th and 16th centuries, and also the Baroque eras, the 17th and first half of the 18th. But they began to fall out of vogue with the popularization of landscape gardening. But Levens Hall in England's Lake District boasts the world's oldest topiary garden, and it's yew trees, and it was designed by Monsieur Guillaume Beaumont, and it dates from 1694. And I think that I have seen this in the spring, and I've also seen it in the fall, in September, but I've never seen it in the snow. And on the right, this piece by Igor Mitura, who was a Polish sculptor. And this enormous mask, and it is enormous, is at once classical and ethereal. The highly respected sculptor Barbara Hepworth believed that sculpture grows in the open light, and with the movement of the sun, its aspect is always changing. With space and the sky above, it can expand and breathe. And now we move on to obsessions. The Dutch tulip bulb market bubble was one of the most famous market bubbles and crashes of all time. Also known as tulip mania, it occurred in Holland during the early to mid 1600s, when speculation drove the value of tulip bulbs to extremes. The rarest traded for as much as 6 times the average person's annual salary at the market's peak. And it was said that for one bulb, the price that you paid for one bulb, you would be able to buy a house in a very good area of Amsterdam. The story of tulip mania serves as a parable for the pitfalls of excessive greed and speculative investing. And on the left, this very extravagant form of a pyramid flower vase is a reference to Chinese pagodas, which were known to the Dutch from Chinese porcelain patterns. And obviously, it was a wonderful vessel for displaying the incredibly expensive tulips that you had bought. On the right, Flora's Wagon of Fools. This work by Henrik Gerrit's Pot was painted after the collapse of the tulip bubble. He makes fun of tulip mania and denounces the dangers created by the passion. Here you see the goddess Flora, dressed like a courtesan, and she's holding a few of the most sought-after varieties of bulb. At her back is a banner also emblazoned with tulips. And behind the cart, you can see several distinguished citizens begging to be taken on board. The 2 women seated in the front are called Forget Everything. One of them is Forget Everything, and she's weighing tulip bulbs. And the other is Vain Hope, who is freeing the vain bird of hope. And for another obsession, and again, I came across this quite by chance. For all the cinematic wizardry, the biggest scene stealer in the film musical Wizard might have been the glorious fields of real tulips planted in colour-blocked rows that lead to Munchkin Land, which was a set in Norfolk, England. For the opening scene of Wicked, 9 million tulip bulbs were planted by tulip farmer Mark Eves and his team. And the director of Wizard said he didn't want to use CGI computer-generated images. He wanted the people who were playing the Munchkins to really be running through those fields. So I see this very much as another obsession. Orchids, whose origins date back millions of years, are the most diverse and highly evolved flowering plant on Earth. Around 28,000 species make them the largest of all plant families, and in the tropical wilderness, orchids are the most promiscuous of plants, crossbreeding with other species to create equally fertile natural hybrids. And I put this one up because this was discovered by the Mexican botanists Pablo de la Llave and Juan Martinez de Lexaza, and they discovered this species in 1825. Now, orchid delirium is the name given to the 19th century flower madness for collecting orchids. But today, there still exists some level of orchid madness. In 2000, for example, a man called Tom Hart Dyke, an avid collector of rare plant species, he and his travel companion were kidnapped and held captive for 9 months by FARC guerrillas in Colombia, and it was while they were hunting for rare orchids. Hart Dyke occupied himself by creating a garden containing plants that he'd collected on his trips. He fortunately had a notebook with him, and this is what he was able to do. Martha McDowell, who's the author of a most entertaining and informative book called Gardening Can Be Murder, which is about how much gardens figure in mystery and detective novels, she believes that Charles Darwin's treatise on orchids would have sold better if, instead of the title being The Various Contrivances by which British and Foreign Orchids are Fertilized by Insects, that it would have been much better if it had been Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Orchid Sex, but were afraid to ask. On the right, the overwhelming world of desire. Inspired by the giant orchid Paphiopedilum Winston Churchill hybrid, the artist Mark Quinn saw the orchid as a pure product of human desire, saying, its natural habitat is the plant nursery or the mind of the person who created it. And the vast scale of this orchid, because this piece is over 8 meters tall, means that if we as viewers stand next to it, we're reduced to the size of insects. Another obsession was fern fever, or pteridomania, and it hit Britain and other countries between 1840 and 1890, and the craze for collecting ferns reached such epidemic proportions that it affected the very existence of some species. Now, it was particularly popular among the upper and middle classes, and it was considered a healthy hobby for women. And it was one of the few activities that they were allowed to do on their own. Up until that point, gardening was a male-dominated activity, and women were often not allowed in the garden at all, or not allowed to garden at all. Ferns were seen as polite plants because they don't display any overt sexual functions. So young ladies could be associated with them as it was acceptable for them to be involved in their propagation. The 19th century author Charles Dickens suggested that his daughter care for ferns to cure her of her perceived apathy, while another wrote that it was a healthier occupation for young women than novels and gossip. However, ferns have also long been associated with the female sex, bringing to mind, and I quote, moist nether regions and shady places. Certain types of fern are even referred to as maidenhair, an overt reference to pubic hair. And another kind of obsession. If you type gardens in Mexican art to do a Google search, the first few entries are for Las Posas, named recently one of the 100 top great gardens in the world. Now, as I watched the popular English gardener and television presenter Monty Don wander around Las Posas in his series Around the World in 80 Gardens, what struck me more than anything was the stunned and somewhat bewildered expression on his face as he told the camera, "This place just plunges you under the water of irrationality and the subconscious and says swim. It's upsetting me. I don't know what to think." It's described as a surrealist Xanadu. And Las Posas was the brainchild of Edward James, a very wealthy, eccentric English aristocrat, poet, and enthusiastic supporter and patron of surrealist artists such as Leonora Carrington. Among natural and artificial pools, waterfalls, buildings that evoke fantasy, doors that open to nothing, stairs that lead up to the sky, visitors enter a dream world as the surrealist labyrinth unfolds. It was very much Edward James's obsession, and he had the money to pay for it, and an army of workers to create his dream, 150 of them. Unlike Ferdinand Cheval, a French postman born in 1836, who at aged 43 proceeded to spend the next 33 years building his ideal palace out of river-washed stones and fossils. He called it his temple to nature. And now to gardeners. Creating and developing a garden was a well-respected pastime for the Aztec Mexica elite. Teams of professional gardeners linked their expert knowledge of plants to the sacred calendar. And so highly developed and regulated was the art of gardening that strict laws prevented commoners from growing or picking certain flowers. And in the middle, we have the gardener, a fanciful figure, smartly dressed with a swag of fruit and foliage encircling his waist. And it's from a suite of engravings known as the Physiognomy of the Trades. Our gardener here wears a velvet hat, festooned with leaves. He has a rose in his lapel, and his special attributes are his shears and his watering can. On the right, Eugene Grasset's portrayal of the first month of the year. And here we see a determined young woman, which is good to see, bundled up against the cold, clearing away the hardened snow in a formal garden. But even in January, despite the bare branches of the trees and the ice-covered fountain, there's a promise of a floral display, as evidenced by the bright red cherries you see in the foreground on the holly bush. Now, Grasset designed his calendar pages as a promotional gift for the Parisian department store La Belle Jardinière. And the left, The Gardeners by Gustave Caillebotte. And Gustave Caillebotte was an artist. He was one of Monet's patrons, and he was also had a passionate interest in gardens. And this was the large vegetable garden at his family's summer home in a town about 19 kilometers outside Paris. And notice that the hired gardeners are working barefoot, and that's to avoid trampling down the furrows. Canadian poet Lorna Crozier wrote a series of poems about the sex lives of vegetables. And here's her take on onions. The onion loves the onion, hugs its many layers, saying, "Oh, oh, oh." Each vowel smaller than the last. Some say it has no heart. It doesn't need one. It surrounds itself, feels whole, primordial. If Eve had bitten it instead of the apple, how different paradise. She also has one about carrots, but the language there is, I decided that perhaps on a Friday morning it was a little too blue to recite. On the right we have Gardener by J. Lynn Gomez. This was one of a life-size painted cardboard cutout. He did them of gardeners, nannies, and housekeepers. And I say he because when I first saw this, this artist was Ramiro Gomez and has now transitioned and is now J. Lynn Gomez. So I'm mixing up my pronouns a little bit. But in 2012, they were installed, a number of them, in areas of Beverly Hills. And because J. Lynn Gomez is the child of undocumented Mexican workers in California, the artist wanted to draw attention to what she called the invisible workers. And Mr. Tatsugoro Matsumoto, born in 1861, died in 1955. He worked as a landscape architect for the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. In 1896, at age 35, he moved permanently to Mexico. And President Pascual Ortiz Rubio, president from 1930 to 32, had wanted cherry trees to be planted along Mexico City's main avenues, much as they are in areas of Washington, D.C. But Mr. Matsumoto told him they weren't appropriate for the climate of Mexico City, and he advocated for Brazilian jacaranda trees to be planted instead. Yes. And on the right, I have to mention Ana Ashida, who is a wonderful garden designer from Guadalajara, and whose gardens, she has designed Bridget's garden in Tepoztlan, parts of our garden in Tepoztlan, and for people in Cuernavaca. So she absolutely deserves to be recognized today. And Margaret Atwood. Margaret Atwood, a passionate gardener herself, the great Canadian novelist, who wrote, "Gardening is not a rational act. What matters is the immersion of the hands in the earth. In the spring, at the end of the day, you should smell like dirt." And given that the title of this talk said Earthly Delights, I felt I had to include The Garden of Earthly Delights by Hieronymus Bosch. This is just the middle panel. And it features a bizarre panoramic landscape populated by slender little nudes who cavort not only with each other, but also with horses, pigs, and creatures that defy any known classification. Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights appears to illustrate the irresistible force of carnal corruption that leads humanity to sin. The precise message behind his iconography continues to baffle scholars. And on the right, the Oaxacan artist Maximino Javier, his En el Jardín. And if you look in the center, all we have is a rather slender cactus plant. And yesterday, I found this. And I have to thank Salvador, who helps me, Salvador Espinosa, who helps me with all the technical parts of my talks and who has endless patience, that this is called El Jardín de las Delicias, and it's by the Mexican artist Ruben Ortiz Torres, and it is a motorized tractor lawnmower on artificial grass. So I appreciate his humor. And this is an artist's interpretation of what is going to be unveiled at this year's Chelsea Flower Show, because it's called Avanade, and it's going to be the first artificial intelligence garden. So visitors will be encouraged to have a chat with it. Garden designer Tom Massey has partnered with Microsoft to create the Avanade Intelligent Garden. AI will continuously monitor factors like soil moisture, pH, temperature, air quality, wind, and rainfall through a network of sensors in the soil. And visitors will be able to ask the question, how are you? How are you doing? And to finish with a few more quotes. If you have a garden and a library, you have everything you need. Gardens are layered art in a living medium by Martin McDowell, the author of Gardening Can Be Murder. And the soul cannot thrive in the absence of a garden. And finally, Mineo Minier was not a particularly well-known poet or author, but this, I think, is very telling. When the world wearies and society fails to satisfy, there is always the garden. And as I said at the beginning, this talk is very, very much for Bridget, our Girlsworthy Estavillo, and for Terry Truitt. Thank you.